Remember those cigarette packs your parents or grandparents used to keep on the kitchen counter? The ones with the gold crests, bold fonts, and that faint smell of nostalgia? Back then, every brand had its own personality, from the rugged to the refined, and each one told a quiet story about the people who smoked them. Some were icons of Canadian pride, others just cheap smokes for long work days, but they all vanished without much fanfare. So let's light up some memories and take a slow drag through 21 vanished cigarette brands. Only true Canadians remember. Sweet Caporal. There was a time when the name Sweet Caporal wasn't just something you'd see in an antique ad. It was practically part of Canada's national aroma. Long before vaping clouds and nicotine patches, Sweet Caporal was the cigarette your grandfather reached for after Sunday dinner or during a quiet walk home from work. The brand's origins date back to the late 19th century, when tobacco companies were still rolling their products by hand and packaging them in soft paper boxes that would crumple in your coat pockets. Introduced by the American Tobacco Company and later produced in Montreal by Imperial Tobacco, Sweet Caporal quickly became one of the most recognizable cigarette names in Canada. Its simple red and white packaging a mark of reliability. It wasn't just a cigarette, it was an era. During the early 20th century, advertisements for Sweet Caporal painted it as refined yet approachable, the smoke for the everyday gentleman. It appeared in movie theaters, sports programs, and even wartime posters, often alongside slogans that made smoking sound downright patriotic. Soldiers in World War II were issued tobacco rations, and many of them lit up Sweet Caporals in muddy trenches and on freezing European nights. The brand became a symbol of comfort, a reminder of home in a time when the world felt unbearably uncertain. The ingredients were straightforward: Virginia and Burley tobaccos, hand-cured and blended for a mild flavor that didn't punch too hard. It wasn't fancy, and it didn't need to be. The appeal was its balance. Smooth enough for the working class, respectable enough for the office crowd. Back then, people didn't ask for light or bold. They just wanted something that burned evenly and tasted familiar. Sweet Caporal delivered that in spades. Lighting one was practically a ritual. A flick of a match, a quiet inhale, the first exhale curling into the cold Canadian air. The scent mingled with wood smoke, coffee, and the distant hum of a city that still felt small enough to know your neighbors. Even those who never smoked could recognize the smell. It clung to wool coats and diner counters, to old hockey arenas and taxi seats. Sweet Caporal wasn't just in people's hands, it was in the wallpaper of the country's collective memory. Of course, by the 1960s, the winds began to shift. The health studies came, the ads disappeared, and so did the easy glamour. Imperial tried to keep Sweet Caporal alive through rebranding efforts, but the name slowly faded as Canadians turned to other, newer options, or quit altogether. By the time the anti-smoking laws hit full force, Sweet Caporal had become a relic, a whisper from a time when no one blinked at someone lighting up in a hospital waiting room. Today, Sweet Caporal survives mainly in vintage collections and old film reels. Its logo a piece of nostalgic design rather than a vice. But for those who remember it, that red and white pack still carries the weight of memory, of uncles, grandfathers, and factory workers standing outside in the cold, sharing a light and a story. It's not just a vanished brand, it's a vanished world, one puff of smoke at a time. Craven A. Once upon a time, before smoking alternatives meant sleek little gadgets that light up blue, there was Craven A. The cigarette that promised to be kind to your throat. Yes, that was the actual slogan. In a world where doctors could appear in cigarette ads, Craven A stood proudly as the refined choice. The smoke that said you had class, but didn't take yourself too seriously. Born from a British lineage and adopted wholeheartedly by Canadians in the 1930s and 40s, it was the brand that felt just a little more sophisticated than the rest. A cigarette for teachers, musicians, and anyone who owned more than one good hat. Craven A came wrapped in an elegant black box with red and gold lettering. Its name derived from the 3rd Earl of Craven, a man of leisure and taste. Or at least that's what the marketing wanted you to think. Imported to Canada during the heyday of British influence, it quickly became a mainstay for those who wanted something smooth, cosmopolitan, and unmistakably proper. If sweet Caporal was the everyman's smoke, Craven A was the one you'd find in the breast pocket of a school teacher or a jazz pianist. It wasn't loud or rugged, it was subtle, with a mild blend of Virginia tobacco that went down easy and didn't leave a bite on the tongue. During the Second World War, Craven A was popular among officers and those stationed abroad. In post-war Canada, it became synonymous with modernity and civility. You'd see its logo in magazines beside fine pens and silk scarves. In Montreal cafes and Toronto lounges, people flicked Craven ashes into porcelain trays while discussing the economy or the latest swing record. The brand exuded quiet confidence, never flashy, always dependable. Even its tagline, "For your throat's sake," was delivered with such conviction that people actually believed it was healthy. The secret to its popularity wasn't just the tobacco, it was the image. Craven A managed to make smoking seem cultured. The cigarette became part of a ritual, a gentle companion to conversation, contemplation, or heartbreak. And let's be honest, it just looked good. The contrast of the black pack against a crisp white shirt was its own kind of advertisement. But like all elegant things, Craven A couldn't last forever. By the 1970s, the world had started catching up with the truth about cigarettes, and Craven A's sophisticated charm couldn't compete with the rugged appeal of American imports, like Marlboro, or the patriotic grit of Canada's own export. The name faded from store shelves, first quietly, then completely, until it was little more than a memory tucked into the pages of old magazines. Today, Craven A lives on as a piece of vintage nostalgia, its packaging still prized by collectors who appreciate the artistry of its time. There's something undeniably poetic about that. The cigarette that claimed to be gentle on your throat now speaks softly through history, reminding us of an age when even vices dressed with elegance. Player's Navy Cut. There's a certain image that comes to mind when you hear Player's Navy Cut. A sailor standing on a cold pier, collar up against the wind, cigarette between his lips as the sea air curls with smoke. For decades, that image wasn't just advertising, it was identity. Players Navy Cut wasn't a luxury brand or a passing fad. It was a symbol of the working man's grit, the blue-collar smoke that found its way into shipyards, rail yards, and every factory break room from Halifax to Vancouver. The brand's roots reach back to the British Navy of the late 19th century, when tobacco was part of the daily rations for sailors. The name Navy Cut referred to the way tobacco was pressed and sliced into neat circular cakes in nod to maritime tradition. Imported to Canada in the early 1900s, Players quickly established itself as a rugged, dependable choice, strong enough to withstand the elements, yet smooth enough for everyday smoke. It was tobacco with muscle, packaged with pride in its iconic tin or soft pack, bearing the image of the steadfast sailor framed in a lifebuoy. In the post-war years, Players Navy Cut became practically a uniform accessory. Dock workers, mechanics, fishermen all knew the familiar blue and white pack. It wasn't about glamour, it was about loyalty. You could count on a Players to light even in the cold wind, to last through a long shift, to accompany your coffee at dawn or your beer at closing time. There was something reassuring about its reliability, its quiet defiance against a changing world. Culturally, Players Navy Cut carried a distinct masculinity, honest, unpolished, and proud. Ads from the 1950s and 60s showed broad-shouldered men in wool coats, gazing toward the horizon with cigarette smoke rising like fog. But women smoked it too, often with the same sense of independence the ads tried to sell. It wasn't just a smoke, it was a companion in solitude, a small ritual of reflection after hard labor or before heading home. The flavor was bold, earthy, and unmistakably old-fashioned. There were no light versions, no menthol twists, just a straightforward, full-bodied burn that stayed true to its seafaring origins. And while Sweet Caporal might have carried the scent of parlors and polished shoes, Players Navy Cut smelled of salt, sweat, and sawdust, a Canada that worked with its hands. By the 1970s, though, the brand began to lose its anchor. Younger smokers turned toward trendier labels like Peter Jackson or international imports. Advertising bans stripped away the rugged imagery that had kept it afloat for generations. The pack designs modernized, the blend softened, and eventually the Navy Cut name itself was phased out, absorbed into the broader Players line. Today, the old tins and ads are collector's items, relics of a time when cigarette brands carried stories instead of warning labels. Seeing that sailor's face now feels like spotting a ghost ship in the fog, a reminder of when men came home smelling of the sea and tobacco, and a cigarette wasn't just a habit, but a hard-earned pause between tides. Sportsman. If there was ever a cigarette that smelled like the locker rooms of small-town arenas and the back seats of pickup trucks, it was Sportsman. This was the brand for the Canadian everyman, the factory worker, the fisherman, the guy who fixed his own carburetor and had a thermos of black coffee riding shotgun. Sportsman wasn't elegant or mysterious, and it certainly wasn't imported. It was plain, dependable, and proud of it. Lighting one after a day of hard work wasn't indulgence. It was punctuation. Introduced in the 1950s, Sportsman quickly found its audience among those who didn't want their cigarette to make a statement beyond, "I earned this." The pack, simple and sturdy with its bold lettering, felt like a badge of endurance. There was no sleek black packaging or gold trim, just a clean red and white design that said it all. In a way, it mirrored post-war Canada itself, unpretentious, resilient, and quietly proud of getting things done. The advertisements were pure grit and sunshine. Men hauling nets, chopping wood, skating on frozen ponds, or relaxing after a long hunt. You could almost smell the mix of tobacco and pine needles. Sportsman was marketed as the smoke of stamina, the choice of those who spent more time outdoors than in offices. If Sweet Caporal was the city smoke and Craven A the intellectual's choice, Sportsman was born from the country, rooted in the rhythm of weather and work. The blend was stronger than most, full-bodied but smooth, made from Canadian-grown tobaccos with just enough bite to feel substantial. It wasn't for the faint-hearted or casual smoker. It had heft, the kind that filled a lung and made you cough the first time before you pretended you meant to. But that was part of its character. Sportsman wasn't delicate, it was honest. You didn't sip it, you smoked it like a statement of belonging. The brand became especially popular among working-class men in rural Ontario, Manitoba, and the Maritimes. Its name alone carried an identity. To be a sportsman was to be strong, reliable, and always game for the next challenge. For decades, its presence was as steady as a snowstorm in January. You could find a pack on diner counters, in tackle boxes, or on the dashboards of trucks idling outside curling rinks. But like all things built on endurance, even Sportsman couldn't outlast the changing winds of the late 20th century. As public attitudes towards smoking shifted, the rugged cigarette lost its place. Anti-smoking campaigns made the manly smoke trope feel outdated, and younger generations turned toward lighter, trendier brands, or away from tobacco altogether. By the 1990s, Sportsman had become less a brand and more a memory, fading quietly from shelves as its loyal smokers aged out of habit and time. Today, spotting an old Sportsman pack feels like finding a fossil from another kind of Canada. A country that ran on elbow grease and early mornings, where smoke curled above hockey rinks and logging camps, and where being a sportsman meant not just playing the game, but surviving it. Du Maurier. There was a time when Du Maurier was the height of Canadian sophistication, the kind of cigarette that lived in glove compartments of polished Buicks and on cafe tables beside porcelain ashtrays. Where Sportsman belonged in the tackle box, Du Maurier belonged in the clutch purse. It wasn't loud or rugged, it was smooth, elegant, and just a little bit aloof. You didn't light a Du Maurier after chopping wood. You lit one after dinner, when the table was cleared and conversation had softened into jazz. Named after Lady Daphne du Maurier, the brand carried a whiff of European refinement from the very beginning. It was launched in Canada in the 1930s by Imperial Tobacco, a time when the country still looked across the Atlantic for cues on class and taste. The name alone set it apart, French, literary, and almost cinematic. While other cigarettes promise strength or stamina, De Maurier promised style. Its crimson and gold pack gleamed like a lipstick case, instantly recognizable, deliberately glamorous. By the 1950s and 60s, De Maurier had become synonymous with the middle class on the rise. The teachers, salesmen, and young professionals who had traded factory floors for office desks. It was aspirational but not out of reach, a touch of luxury for those who wanted to feel worldly without leaving home. The ads were filled with confident men in suits and women in cocktail dresses, both framed in a haze of soft smoke. The message was clear. A De Maurier smoker had arrived, wherever they were. The cigarette itself lived up to the image, silky, mild, and meticulously blended. It wasn't about punch or power, it was about poise. The flavor was smooth and balanced, with none of the bite of a sportsman or a player's Navy cut. It became the brand you smoked if you wanted to be noticed for the right reasons. Quietly refined, never brash. Even its smell seemed more polished, less intrusive, like good perfume rather than a blue-collar badge. Du Maurier also became deeply Canadian in its own right. While its name was British, its cultural roots grew north of the border. It sponsored everything from jazz festivals to film awards, its logo appearing at galas and theaters instead of bar rooms and barns. For a generation, Du Maurier represented a Canada in transition, urbanizing, educated, and proud to have a touch of class. It was the cigarette of CBC announcers and cocktail parties, a prop that said as much about aspiration as it did about taste. But by the 1990s, that same aura of sophistication began to work against it. As smoking lost its glamour, the red and gold pack began to feel like a relic of an older kind of chic, one that belonged to smoky restaurants and long lunches, places that were vanishing fast. When advertising bans took effect, Du Maurier lost its main stage. Without its elegant image, it became just another pack behind the counter, stripped of the mystique that once made it shimmer. Today, the name lingers on out of habit more than fashion, a ghost of mid-century polish. But for those who remember, Du Maurier will always conjure the soft glow of downtown nights, the clink of crystal glasses, and the curl of smoke rising like a sigh from a cigarette that once made Canada feel a little more cosmopolitan. Export A, Green Death. If Du Maurier was the brand of urban cool and quiet elegance, then Export A was its rowdy cousin from up north. The one who drove a pickup, wore flannel in every season, and didn't give a damn what the city folks thought. Canadians nicknamed it Green Death, and they said it with equal parts dread and respect. Its deep green pack was a warning label before warning labels existed. This cigarette meant business. Launched by Imperial Tobacco in the 1920s, Export A began as a working man's smoke. It wasn't the kind of cigarette you idly puffed while sipping espresso. It was the kind you lit after hauling timber or finishing a 12-hour shift at the mill. The A stood for extra quality, a promise that meant something in the days before marketing became all glitter and buzzwords. The blend was strong, harsh even, but in a way that made you feel alive. It had a throat hit that announced itself like a slap on the back from an old friend who didn't know his own strength. By the 1960s and 70s, Export A had become woven into the Canadian identity, especially outside the big cities. It was the cigarette of loggers, fishermen, farmers, and the kind of guys who'd fix your snowmobile with a wrench and a swear. Every province had its loyalists, but in the rugged parts of the country, the Green Pack was practically a badge of honor. Lighting one was a small declaration: "I can handle it." Its packaging helped seal the legend. That iconic green box with the white ship and red crest stood out in every gas station display, a flash of defiant color amid rows of polite whites and blues. The logo, a stylized sailing ship, hinted at adventure, export, and endurance. It made smoking seem like an act of frontier toughness, a throwback to a time when men built things with their hands and women weren't afraid of a little frostbite. But it wasn't just for the tough crowd. There was a strange romance to Export A, that sense of rebellion and independence that appealed to anyone who felt boxed in by polite society. It was the cigarette of road trips, bonfires, and backseat conversations. For many Canadians, their first real drag came from a friend's crumpled pack of Green Death behind the arena after hockey practice. Harsh? Absolutely. Memorable? Always. As health campaigns intensified in the late 20th century, Export A carried on stubbornly, like a character out of a Farley Mowat story, grizzled, loyal, and slightly out of time. While other brands softened their image, Export A never apologized for what it was. Even after the name became a half-whispered joke in anti-smoking circles, its legend only grew. Some said it was the last real cigarette left. The taste of authenticity before everything went filtered, flavored, and fake. Today, you can still spot the Green Pack in retro photos and roadside nostalgia collections. For many Canadians, seeing it is like catching a glimpse of a ghost in a plaid jacket. Rough around the edges, maybe a little reckless, but undeniably real. Export A was never about glamour. It was about grit, pride, and the satisfaction of a smoke that didn't need to impress anyone. In a country that prides itself on surviving 6 months of winter, maybe that's why we love the Green Death so much. It was Canada in cigarette form. Cameo. Cameo was the cigarette that tried to charm you softly. Not too brash, not too elegant, just enough style to stand apart on a drugstore shelf without shouting. With its crisp white pack and understated script, it looked like the kind of cigarette your aunt kept in her purse, next to a handkerchief and a compact mirror. It wasn't the smoke of loggers or debutantes. It was for the in-between crowd, the quiet dreamers and office workers who wanted a little dignity in their coffee break. Introduced by Imperial Tobacco in the mid-20th century, Cameo arrived during an age of transition. The war was over, prosperity was rising, and cigarettes were shifting from symbols of rebellion to accessories of everyday life. Cameo's marketing leaned into that new normal. It was clean, reliable, and mildly refined, less of a vice and more of a habit that didn't demand an identity. While Players and Export A puffed out their chests, Cameo exhaled gracefully, content to stay in the background. The taste matched its image, smooth, mild, and slightly sweet. It wasn't made to knock you back. It was made to keep you company. For many, it was their first grown-up cigarette, the one that felt acceptable to smoke around the dinner table after a long week. Its gentleness made it popular among women and older smokers who wanted something dependable without the punch of the rougher brands. You could say Cameo was the cardigan of cigarettes. Unassuming, soft-edged, but still comforting. Visually, its branding leaned towards sophistication without pretension. The name Cameo evoked vintage jewelry, delicate, personal, timeless. It was a smart move. In a decade when glamour often meant excess, Cameo sold the idea of modest elegance. It was the quiet counterpoint to the red and gold dazzle of Du Maurier. Where Du Maurier was champagne, Cameo was tea in a porcelain cup. Cameo's popularity peaked in the 1950s and 60s, a period when smoking was as natural as breathing. But as taste toughened and cultural winds shifted, its subtlety became a liability. The mildness that once made it inviting started to feel old-fashioned. By the time the Marlboro Man and rugged branding took over North American advertising, Cameo's polite charm seemed out of step. It was too gentle for an age obsessed with boldness. In the decades that followed, as smoking bans and health warnings spread, Cameo faded without much fuss, exactly how it lived. It didn't go out in scandal or protest. It simply stopped showing up in convenience stores. For many Canadians, its disappearance wasn't even noticed until years later, when someone stumbled upon an old pack in a parent's drawer or an antique tin in a thrift shop. That's when nostalgia kicked in. Cameo was never a cultural giant, but it was quietly beloved, a steady companion for those who didn't need to be defined by their smoke. Today, it's remembered less for any daring ad campaign or celebrity endorsement, and more for what it represented: the calm middle ground of a smoky century. A cigarette that never tried to shock or seduce, just one that offered a brief, familiar pause between long hours and small joys. In a world where every brand now fights to be noticed, Cameo's quiet dignity feels almost radical, a vanished whisper in a loud, caffeinated age. Matinee. Matinee always sounded like a cigarette meant for Sunday afternoons, the kind you'd light after brunch while flipping through a glossy magazine or sitting on the porch watching the laundry sway. The name itself, borrowed from the world of early cinema, promised sophistication without snobbery. A matinee was the daytime show, the lighter act before the main event. And that's exactly what this cigarette embodied. A softer, smoother experience designed for those who wanted the ritual of smoking without the harshness. Launched by Imperial Tobacco in the mid-20th century, Matinee positioned itself as the refined alternative to the heavy hitters. If Export A was the lumberjack cigarette and Player's Navy Cut was for the sailors, Matinee was for the secretaries, teachers, and suburban dreamers who preferred something milder, something that wouldn't cling too strongly to a cardigan or the upholstery of a sedan. Its tagline often danced around themes of sophistication and composure, smoking as part of a modern, graceful life. The packaging reflected that image perfectly. Soft blues and silvers, a minimalist crest, and lettering that seemed to sigh rather than shout. It didn't need flames and lions to prove its worth. Matinee whispered it. The name evoked daylight, civility, and a kind of cinematic poise. A smoke for those who wanted to feel elegant even in the middle of an ordinary day. And for a long time, it worked. In the 1960s and 70s, it became a quiet favorite, particularly among women and the growing middle class who were looking for a cigarette that seemed a little more polite. The taste matched its branding, mild, filtered, and faintly aromatic. It was a cigarette you could smoke in your car with the windows cracked, one that didn't leave your throat raw or your fingers smelling like last night's bonfire. To its fans, Matinee was dependable, clean, balanced, and civilized. In an era before nicotine patches and vapes, this was as close as cigarettes came to health conscious. You could imagine a matinee smoker telling themselves, well, at least it's light. But as time moved on, lightness became its undoing. When the tobacco industry faced mounting criticism in the late 20th century, the very thing that made Matinee appealing, its mild flavor and delicate branding, started to look like denial. The word light disappeared from packaging, and health-conscious consumers abandoned cigarettes altogether. Matinee, once the symbol of controlled elegance, was now caught between two worlds, too refined for the old-school crowd, too dated for the new generation of non-smokers. By the early 2000s, it was all but gone, remembered mainly by those who had tucked a soft pack into their purse before heading to the bus stop or office lounge. Its ghost lingers in old television commercials and the faded signage on corner stores that never got repainted. Looking back, Matinee represents a particular kind of Canadian nostalgia. The tidy, pastel-toned optimism of post-war life, when even a cigarette could feel like a small act of self-care. It wasn't rebellious or rough. It was a smoke for people who didn't want to make a scene. And maybe that's why it's still remembered so fondly. It offered a brief illusion of grace in a habit built on grit. In the crowded theater of cigarette history, Matinee wasn't the star of the show, but for a time, it was the most elegant supporting act you could find. Belvedere. Belvedere sounded grand, didn't it? A name borrowed from European estates and hilltop manors, it promised a little class in every puff. For many Canadians in the 1950s and 60s, lighting a Belvedere felt like stepping just a notch above the ordinary. You weren't a dock worker with a crumpled pack of sportsmen, nor were you trying too hard with the glossy Du Maurier crowd. Belvedere lived somewhere in the middle, an approachable kind of elegance. The cigarette for people who wanted to feel a little fancy without pretending to be rich. The brand came out of Canada's golden age of domestic tobacco, when nearly every city corner store carried a lineup of proud local smokes. Belvedere positioned itself as smooth, balanced, and just refined enough for an evening out. Even the pack, white and silver, trimmed with modest ornamentation, carried that promise. It looked like something you might pull from a blazer pocket before stepping out into a chilly Ontario night. The kind of cigarette that went hand in hand with pressed collars, chrome ashtrays, and good manners. Its advertising leaned on quiet sophistication. The message wasn't rebellion or rugged independence. It was composure. Belvedere smokers were portrayed as steady, self-assured, perhaps even urbane. It was a cigarette that didn't yell. It smiled politely and offered you one. In a world of booming masculinity and cowboy branding, Belvedere's gentler approach made it something of a Canadian classic, a cigarette for the middle ground. The taste reflected its presentation, smooth, mild, and just a touch sweet. You could say it was a cigarette that didn't try to pick a fight with you. It lacked the bold throatiness of Export A or the peppery bite of Player's Navy Cut. But that was the point. Belvedere was the everyday smoke for those who wanted a consistent, respectable companion. Never too strong, never too soft. For decades, it earned quiet loyalty from school teachers, accountants, and suburban dads who kept a pack in the glove compartment just in case. Of course, the very qualities that made Belvedere dependable also doomed it when tastes began to shift. By the 1980s, smoking was losing its social shine, and the understated brands began to vanish one by one. Belvedere, without controversy or scandal, simply slipped into the background. The name, once evoking refinement, now sounded like a relic from another era, something you might see printed on an old matchbook in a diner display case. Still, there's something comforting in remembering Belvedere. It represents a specific kind of nostalgia, the mid-century Canadian balance between aspiration and humility. It wasn't glamorous or gritty. It was solid, like the station wagons and wool coats of the time. Belvedere didn't chase trends. It simply existed, quietly elegant in its own way. Today, if you mention Belvedere to an older Canadian smoker, you might see a small smile, one that says, "Ah, I remember those." It's not the kind of cigarette people brag about, but the kind they remember fondly, a reminder of a slower, more deliberate era, when even a simple smoke could carry a hint of dignity. McDonald's. McDonald's wasn't just another cigarette brand. It was a piece of Canadian tobacco royalty. Named after the McDonald Tobacco Company of Montreal, the brand carried the weight of legacy, craftsmanship, and a distinctly Canadian sense of pride. Before global giants took over the market, McDonald's stood as a homegrown name you could trust, a symbol of the country's early cigarette industry. When national brands were more than just logos, they were local institutions. The McDonald Tobacco Company had roots reaching back to the late 19th century, an era when tobacco was still sold loose, and smoking was as much a social ritual as a personal indulgence. By the time McDonald's cigarettes appeared in the mid-20th century, the name was already synonymous with reliability. The packaging was crisp and stately, dark reds, gold trim, and the kind of serif lettering that looked straight out of a well-kept gentleman's club. You didn't light a McDonald's cigarette to make a statement. You lit it because it was familiar, consistent, and Canadian through and through. The flavor reflected that identity, bold but balanced, with a toasted edge that gave it backbone without bitterness. It was the kind of cigarette you could imagine tucked behind the ear of a railway worker, or resting in an ashtray beside a black coffee in a corner diner. While brands like De Maurier and Matinee angled for sophistication, McDonald's had a working-class dignity. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid, just like the people who smoked it. There was also a sense of patriotism attached to it. Long before buy local was trendy, McDonald's was the pride of domestic tobacco, marketed with subtle nods to its Canadian roots. In the post-war decades, when imported brands began flooding the shelves, McDonald's held firm, standing as a familiar friend in a changing marketplace. For many, that red and gold pack felt like home. a small reminder of continuity amid the cultural shifts of the 1960s and 70s. But as the cigarette wars intensified and health regulations tightened, even the mighty McDonald's couldn't withstand the pressure. The brand started to fade quietly, its once proud crest losing space on store displays to flashier modern imports. By the late 1980s, it was mostly a memory, recalled fondly by those who had grown up in a time when every small town had a corner shop with a McDonald's sign in the window. What makes McDonald's worth remembering isn't just its flavor or design, but what it represented, a uniquely Canadian chapter in tobacco history. It was a brand rooted in craftsmanship, not marketing gimmicks. A cigarette that stood for dependability rather than drama. There was something steady, even comforting, about its presence. In a world of changing tastes and disappearing icons, McDonald's felt like the last smoke of an era when things were built to last. Today, its name lives on mostly in collectors' circles and among those who stumble upon old tins or enamel signs at flea markets. Each piece carries the faint scent of nostalgia, the memory of red matchbooks, cafe chatter, and the faint curl of smoke on a winter morning. McDonald's may have burned out, but it did so with quiet dignity, the way most Canadian legends do. Dominion. Dominion was the kind of cigarette that carried its pride right on the pack. The name alone sounded sturdy, patriotic, like something that could only have been born in Canada's post-war years, when the word Dominion still appeared on banknotes and national seals. This was a cigarette for the everyman, but with a sense of national gravitas. Lighting a Dominion was, in its own small way, like tipping your hat to the flag. Introduced by the McDonald Tobacco Company, Dominion was built on the same foundation as the brand's other staples: honest tobacco, steady quality, and a promise of reliability. It wasn't a cigarette that needed gimmicks or glitz. The packaging said it all: deep reds, royal blues, and bold lettering that looked like something straight off a recruiting poster. There was a quiet authority to it, a sense that Dominion wasn't trying to be fashionable, it was dependable. Its taste matched its image: full-bodied, slightly woody, and unmistakably tobacco-forward. There was no pretense of smoothness or light sophistication here. Dominion was the smoke of mechanics, railroad men, and farmers who worked long hours and wanted something that could stand up to the cold. It was a cigarette meant to be felt in the lungs, not merely tasted on the tongue. If Du Maurier was a symphony, Dominion was a brass band, bold, brash, and unapologetically Canadian. In the 1950s and 60s, it earned quiet loyalty across the provinces, especially in rural and industrial communities. You could find Dominion packs stuffed in glove compartments, coat pockets, and the drawers of small-town general stores. It was the cigarette you shared during a coffee break, the one passed around at hunting lodges and curling rinks. Dominion had a kind of quiet fraternity about it, an unspoken nod between those who chose it. Advertising for Dominion leaned heavily on patriotism. It wasn't just a cigarette, it was a brand that represented the working backbone of the country. Ads often featured rugged landscapes, strong hands, and slogans that emphasized dependability and Canadian pride. This wasn't the cigarette of rebellion, it was the cigarette of belonging. It fit neatly into a time when national identity was tied to craftsmanship, modesty, and endurance. But by the 1980s, those values and the culture around them were changing. The old guard of Canadian cigarette brands started vanishing under pressure from global competitors and shifting health attitudes. Dominion, with its straightforward masculinity and patriotic branding, began to look dated next to the sleek international style of Marlboro or Camel. Its red and blue confidence belonged to an earlier era, and as the Dominion name itself faded from Canada's official lexicon, so too did the cigarette that bore it. Still, there's something deeply nostalgic about Dominion's memory. It belongs to a time when cigarette packs sat beside pocket knives and matchbooks on kitchen tables, when the smell of tobacco mingled with sawdust and fresh snow. Dominion wasn't about image, it was about identity. And though it's long gone from convenience store shelves, it lingers in memory like the smoke of a wood stove, familiar, comforting, and distinctly Canadian. Buckingham. Buckingham sounded like it came from across the Atlantic, and that was entirely the point. In an era when Canadians were still half in love with British refinement, the name carried an air of upper crust respectability. Lighting a Buckingham felt like borrowing a little of that imagined polish. A smoke that let you pretend, even for a few minutes, that your coffee break was an afternoon tea. Produced by Imperial Tobacco, Buckingham entered the market in the mid-20th century with a quietly ambitious goal: to blend everyday affordability with a whisper of elegance. Its branding leaned toward the sophisticated, gold trim, serif lettering, and a crest that wouldn't have looked out of place on fine stationery. In an age when cigarettes were as much fashion as vice, Buckingham positioned itself as the refined alternative for the modest professional, the kind who wore wool coats to work and read the paper on the train. The cigarette itself matched that image, smooth, dry, and slightly perfumed. It had a restrained taste, a far cry from the throat-punching power of Export A or the salt-of-the-earth grit of Sportsman. Buckingham was all about composure. Its appeal was subtle, designed for those who wanted their smoke to feel deliberate rather than impulsive. For many, it became the indoor cigarette, one you could smoke at the dinner table or after a social call without offending your host. Through the 1950s and 60s, Buckingham held steady as a sort of middle-class marker. It wasn't as glamorous as De Maurier or as rebellious as Player's Navy Cut, but it occupied that genteel in-between space that Canadians were so good at carving out. It was the cigarette of quiet ambition, of people who took pride in doing things properly. Ads often leaned into this idea, pairing images of calm domestic life, fireplaces, polished wood, and tailored suits, with the tagline of quality and composure. By the 1970s, though, that old-world charm began to lose its sheen. The modern smoker wanted something cooler, bolder, more modern. Buckingham's polite manners felt quaint next to the rugged appeal of Marlboro or the slick urban image of De Maurier's later rebrands. Slowly but surely, the brand faded from prominence, outpaced by shifting culture and the tightening grip of anti-smoking sentiment. Yet for those who remember it, Buckingham still conjures a certain nostalgia, a world of black and white television, dinner parties with crystal ashtrays, and the faint hum of civility in the air. It's the scent of your grandparents' living room, the kind of place where everything had its place, and even a cigarette was part of the decorum. Today, Buckingham stands as a small but telling artifact of Canada's post-war identity, measured, polite, and quietly aspirational. It wasn't a cigarette for rebels or thrill seekers. It was for those who believed that class didn't have to shout. In its own modest way, Buckingham smoked like Canada itself once lived. Steady, understated, and unfailingly proper. Embassy. Embassy was one of those cigarette brands that made you feel like you were stepping into something a little more refined than your usual smoke break. The name alone carried weight. Embassy. It sounded official, dignified, and ever so slightly mysterious. A word that suggested diplomacy, marble floors, and leather chairs. For Canadians of the 1960s and 70s, it promised a touch of the international without ever having to leave your small-town cafe stool. Produced by Imperial Tobacco, Embassy emerged during a golden age of branding, when cigarettes weren't just consumables, they were identities wrapped in cellophane. Embassy's image leaned heavily into sophistication. It was marketed as modern but tasteful, the kind of cigarette that appealed to the confident and composed. Its ads favored imagery of stylish men in suits, women with beehive hairdos, and quiet moments of control. You didn't smoke an Embassy to look tough. You smoked one to look collected. The pack design reflected that self-assurance. Clean lines, rich colors, often deep red or burgundy with gold accents, and the brand's crest positioned like a diplomatic seal. It exuded the aura of something official, trustworthy, and a little worldly. Compared to the brashness of Export A or the nostalgia of Sweet Caporal, Embassy came across as urbane, like it belonged in a briefcase next to a fountain pen. The flavor followed suit, smooth and slightly dry, with a controlled finish that appealed to smokers who wanted balance over bite. It didn't try to dominate your palate. It aimed to impress it. Embassy was for people who believed refinement wasn't a performance. It was a habit. The cigarette for the man who ironed his shirts on Sunday night and the woman who never left the house without lipstick. For a while, it worked beautifully. Embassy found a loyal following among professionals and suburbanites who liked their tobacco dignified but not dull. It was the cigarette of polished surfaces and quiet confidence. The smoke that belonged beside highballs and business cards, rather than lunch pails and thermoses. But by the late 1970s, its very strength, its sense of decorum, became a liability. The new generation wasn't buying refinement. They were buying rebellion. Cigarettes were shifting from symbols of poise to emblems of attitude. Marlboro had its cowboy, Players had its Navy man, and Embassy's subtle charm suddenly felt too buttoned up for a culture that wanted its heroes to look scruffy. By the 1990s, Embassy had faded quietly, leaving behind little more than a memory and the occasional vintage pack found in antique shops or tucked away in family keepsakes. Its name lives on as a relic of an era when elegance still mattered, even in something as fleeting as smoke. Looking back, Embassy represented the aspirational side of post-war Canada, the belief that grace could be achieved through small, everyday rituals. It was the cigarette of civility, the calm between storms, the kind of brand that didn't shout because it didn't need to. In a world that now prizes authenticity over polish, Embassy's tidy restraint feels almost foreign, and that's precisely what makes it so unforgettable. Black Cat. Black Cat wasn't your ordinary cigarette. It had an air of superstition and rebellion rolled into every stick. While most brands tried to sell sophistication or class, Black Cat leaned into its own mystique. The name alone was bold, evoking luck, mischief, and the thrill of tempting fate. To light a Black Cat was to wink at the taboo, a little act of defiance against the polite world of filtered manners and mild blends. Originally a British brand introduced in the early 1900s by Carreras Limited, Black Cat eventually made its way into the Canadian market, carrying with it a reputation for being distinct, daring, and a little eccentric. It was one of the first widely sold cigarettes to feature a pre-blended tobacco mixture, rather than a coarse, hand-cut variety, giving it a smoother yet robust flavor that set it apart from its contemporaries. Even in its earliest days, Black Cat wasn't chasing trends, it was setting them. The design was unmistakable. A sleek black pack with the yellow-eyed silhouette of a cat staring out like a knowing accomplice. It looked different, it felt different, in an era where most cigarette packages leaned toward refined crests and heraldic fonts. Black Cat's design was practically a middle finger to convention. You could spot it instantly on a store shelf. A bit of shadow among all the gold and white. Smokers liked that. It was the brand for people who didn't quite fit the mold, who preferred their smoke with a hint of personality. In Canada, Black Cat earned a loyal following among working-class smokers and young adults who wanted something with character. It was less about glamour and more about individuality. You could find it in factory lockers, corner store counters, and glove compartments of old sedans. It had a strong, earthy aroma and a flavor that didn't try to be polite. It was full-bodied, dark, and unapologetic. While the brand enjoyed popularity through the mid-century, it struggled to maintain its footing as filters took over the market and smoking itself became increasingly sanitized. Black Cat, with its rugged charm and no-nonsense attitude, wasn't made to compete with the sleek sophistication of De Maurier or the clean appeal of Matinee. It belonged to an older world, one where cigarettes were meant to taste like tobacco, not compromise. By the 1980s, the brand had largely faded from shelves, surviving only in nostalgia and collectors' cabinets, but its legend endured. Among vintage tobacco enthusiasts, Black Cat remains one of the most recognizable and storied brands ever sold, a symbol of a time when smoking was still wrapped in a touch of danger and allure. Today, the name still carries that same sense of intrigue. Black Cat represents the smoker who wasn't afraid to stand apart, to embrace a bit of darkness in their daily ritual. It was never about sophistication or status. It was about spirit. Lighting one was a quiet act of rebellion, a small, smoky superstition for those who like to live just a little offbeat. Picoback/Sweet Cuba. Before cigarettes ruled the convenience store shelves, there was a quieter, sweeter kind of smoke, the pipe blend. And for Canadians, Picoback and Sweet Cuba were the faithful companions of countless uncles, grandfathers, and old men sitting by the window, pipe in hand, with the radio humming low in the background. These weren't brands built on glamour or rebellion. They were built on comfort, ritual, and the simple pleasure of a slow, aromatic smoke. Picoback was perhaps the most famous of the two, a pipe tobacco that seemed to embody the character of small-town Canada. Sold in its iconic yellow tin, it was the kind of tobacco you'd find in a kitchen drawer or on a workshop shelf, half used, its lid stained from years of loyal service. It carried a mellow, nutty aroma that was both familiar and strangely soothing. If Sweet Caporal was for the social smoker, Picoback was for the quiet thinker. Its scent would linger in the curtains, the wood paneling, and even your memories. Sweet Cuba, meanwhile, leaned toward the exotic, at least by the standards of mid-century Canada. Its name evoked warmth, sun, and a bit of tropical mystery. Even if most Canadians were smoking it through a snowstorm, it offered a slightly richer, sweeter note, with the promise of imported leaf blended into a distinctly Canadian experience. The name Sweet Cuba alone gave it a touch of romance, a faraway dream packed neatly into a pouch of tobacco. Both brands represented a time when smoking wasn't about speed or image. It was about savoring. Pipes required patience. You didn't light one up on the go. You settled in with it. You tamped, puffed, and thought. It was meditative, personal. And that's exactly why Picoback and Sweet Cuba had such staying power. They were steady companions, not status symbols. By the 1970s and 1980s, however, the pipe smoker had become something of an endangered species. The world was moving faster, filters were king, and the ritual of packing a bowl seemed old-fashioned. Younger generations reached for sleek cigarette packs instead of tins. One by one, pipe tobacco brands began to vanish, their space on the shelves replaced by neon lighters and nicotine gum. But in the collective memory, Picoback and Sweet Cuba still hold a soft spot. They're remembered not just for their flavor, but for what they represented: a slower pace of life, a sense of groundedness, and the smell of home on a winter afternoon. Today, collectors still hunt for the old tins, bright little relics of a gentler smoking age. In a way, these two blends were less about indulgence and more about reflection. Each puff felt like a pause button on the world. And while the smoke may have faded, that feeling, that sweet, lingering calm of Picoback and Sweet Cuba, still hangs in the air, at least in memory. Viceroy. If cigarette brands had personalities, Viceroy would have been the one with a clean haircut, polished shoes, and an easy grin. Respectable, modern, and quietly confident. Born in the 1930s under Brown and Williamson, Viceroy broke ground as the first major cigarette to feature a filter, proudly selling itself as smarter smoking. While most brands were still unfiltered and unapologetically harsh, Viceroy positioned itself as the thoughtful choice. The cigarette for those who cared about refinement, and maybe even their lungs. By the time it reached Canada, Viceroy had a reputation for balance and subtlety. Its white packaging, crowned with a royal crest, gave it an air of middle-class sophistication. The taste was mild yet distinct, offering something smoother than Export A, but sturdier than Matinee. It wasn't flashy, but it was dependable. like the cigarette equivalent of a pressed shirt and a steady job. For a while, that worked perfectly. The 1950s and 60s were its golden age, when office workers and teachers could be seen lighting a Viceroy during coffee breaks, believing that the filter made them a bit smarter than the rest. Yet, that same respectability eventually turned into dullness. As tobacco culture shifted toward bold identities and rebellious imagery, Viceroy's sensible persona felt too safe. Smokers gravitated to brands with edge, and Viceroy faded quietly from shelves. Today, it's remembered as the cigarette that tried to make smoking seem responsible, a charming relic from a time when filtered still meant futuristic. Peter Jackson. If any cigarette captured Canada's quiet pride, it was Peter Jackson. With a name that sounded half hockey player, half parliament member, it carried the air of reliability and no-nonsense Canadian grit. Introduced by Imperial Tobacco, Peter Jackson earned its place as the go-to brand for steady, hard-working people. The kind who didn't chase trends, but knew what they liked. Its deep blue crest, gold trim, and solid white packaging gave it a touch of dignity, while the flavor struck that perfect middle ground between strength and smoothness. Advertising leaned into that reliability. Peter Jackson, the Canadian way to smoke, summed it up perfectly. Honest, unpretentious, and proud. You'd find it in the hands of truckers, hockey dads, or office clerks, people who valued consistency over flash. It wasn't as harsh as Export A, nor as refined as De Maurier. It was simply dependable. By the 1990s, as health campaigns and sleek rebrands took over, Peter Jackson's steady image began to fade. But among Canadians who grew up seeing those blue and gold packs at corner stores, it remains a fond memory. A cigarette that, like the people who smoked it, was tough, steady, and true to its roots. Rothmans. Rothmans was the tailored suit of cigarette brands. Sharp, composed, and quietly confident. Its rich blue box, trimmed with gold, exuded a calm authority that made it stand out without ever needing to shout. Founded in London in the 1800s, Rothmans came to Canada as the cigarette for professionals, the boss's brand, the gentleman's pick. Smooth, mild, and balanced, it carried an air of refinement that made lighting one feel like an act of composure. Its ads featured sleek cars, crisp shirts, and polished glasses of scotch, subtle symbols of status without arrogance. In Canada, it became synonymous with elegance, the brand your father might pull out for guests or special occasions. But sophistication has a shelf life. As youth culture turned bolder and anti-smoking sentiment rose, Rothman's old-world charm began to feel dated. Still, its memory lingers, blue, gold, and quietly dignified. A cigarette that turned smoking into a statement of understated class. Winchester. If there was ever a cigarette that tried to capture rugged independence in a puff of smoke, it was Winchester. The name alone carried weight, part rifle, part legend, and unmistakably masculine. Borrowing its identity from the famous firearm, Winchester cigarettes were built on the same ideals: toughness, craftsmanship, and a quiet sense of authority. In the Canada of the 1960s and 1970s, that image fit like a glove for men who spent their days outdoors or on the job. Men who didn't mind a little grit under their nails or smoke in their lungs. Winchester wasn't a delicate cigarette. It was bold, rich, and often rolled in small cigarillo-style sticks that blurred the line between cigar and cigarette. The flavor leaned earthy and woody, with a depth that gave it character. When you lit one, the aroma filled the air like a campfire on a cool night. Strong, smoky, and unforgettable. It wasn't a social cigarette, it was a solitary one. The kind you smoked leaning on a truck tailgate, staring at the horizon, with the wind cutting through your jacket. Its packaging reflected the same frontier spirit. Dark, simple, and commanding. Winchester ads didn't bother with glamour or sophistication. They showed men in flannel, against backdrops of mountains, forests, and wide-open skies. It was tobacco marketing at its most unapologetically masculine. A world away from the sleek, filtered elegance of brands like Rothmans or Du Maurier. Winchester sold authenticity. The idea that a real man's cigarette didn't need polish, just purpose. But times changed. The cowboy spirit faded as the health warnings grew louder, and the Marlboro Man aesthetic began to look like a relic of another world. By the 1980s, sleek, modern branding replaced the rugged frontier image. Winchester, stubbornly old-fashioned and proud of it, disappeared quietly from store shelves. Today, it lingers as one of the most evocative ghosts of Canada's smoking past, a symbol of grit, independence, and an era when lighting a cigarette wasn't just a habit, but a small act of self-definition. Turok. Turok was the working man's cigarette, the brand that lived behind gas station counters and in the shirt pockets of early risers. It didn't advertise with glamour or cowboy swagger. It just existed, solid and reliable, with plain packaging and a full-bodied, earthy taste. Turok was built for farmers, truckers, and factory hands, the kind of people who smoked out of habit, not fashion. It was unpretentious to the core. No sleek campaigns, no European flair. Just a dependable smoke for hard days and early mornings. For decades, it quietly held its place across small-town Canada until marketing trends shifted towards sleek and modern. When it disappeared, few noticed right away, but those who remembered it never forgot its grit. Turok's story is one of quiet endurance, a cigarette that didn't define an image, but reflected a way of life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And in that honesty, it became a small, smoky symbol of Canada's blue-collar heart. Sweet Apple Blend / menthol spin-offs. Every generation has its "what were we thinking" moment, and in Canada's smoking history, that crown belongs to the flavored cigarette craze, led by the curious Sweet Apple Blend and its menthol offshoots. These weren't your dad's rugged export-A smokes. No, these were the bold rebels of the pack, flirting with sweetness, freshness, and just enough oddity to make people wonder if tobacco had lost its mind. Imagine cigarettes trying to compete with soda flavors, and you'll get the picture. Smoky, fruity, and slightly absurd. Introduced in the late 1960s, Sweet Apple Blend was Imperial Tobacco's attempt to woo a younger, trend-conscious crowd without ever saying so outright. Regular cigarettes were for the after-dinner crowd. Sweet Apple was for the curious ones, chasing something smoother and refreshing. It promised a mild tobacco base laced with a subtle apple aroma, more orchard than ashtray. For a brief moment, it worked. Some loved its soft, candy-like draw, and the sweet scent it left hanging in the air. But for most Canadians, it was too light, too floral, too strange. Smokers used to the punchy strength of Rothmans or Players dismissed it as a novelty. The menthol era that followed fared better. Brands like Matinee Menthol and Players Menthol offered that same sense of refreshment, only colder, literally. The ads were all glacial streams and icy mountain air, a perfect match for Canada's wintry image. They became especially popular with smokers who wanted a smoother, cleaner drag, often women seeking a cool alternative to the harsher blends. By the 1990s, the fun was over. Flavored smokes faced growing backlash for luring in young smokers, and regulators swiftly shut the door. Sweet Apple Blend vanished, leaving behind only memories and the faint echo of its sweet, strange aroma. A ghostly reminder of the time tobacco tried to taste like candy. There's something hauntingly familiar about these old cigarette brands, like the scent of a memory that lingers long after it's gone. They remind us of a time when every brand told a story, and every puff carried a little piece of Canadian life with it. If you enjoyed this walk down smoky memory lane, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more forgotten slices of Canadian history. And hey, tell us in the comments, which Vanish brand do you remember most?